Hi guys, this is chapter 13, key issue 2. Oh my golly. Are there a lot of models in this one? I've warned you about that several times. We will be doing map journals for every single one of these. But I would just jot down a few notes about each one, and there's other stuff I'm talking about in here that are not going to be like in your map journals. So just make sure you're taking good notes. It's kind of a doozy, sorry. This is the last chapter for a reason. It's a tricky one. Okay. So, first of all, let's talk about zones because every one of these models is going to have zones in it, and you need to know what I'm talking about when I talk about zones. So, cities are divided into different regions or zones. So, like, there'll be a residential zone where houses are, there's an industrial zone where maybe your factories are, okay? There might be like more of a political zone where your courthouses are and your jails are and things like that, okay? So different zones have different purposes, basically. So typically, you'll notice in cities, there isn't like a house and then a factory and then a grocery store and then another house, right? Like things tend to cluster together. Those are zones. So definitely larger cities do this, okay? And the reason we have these specific areas in large cities is because it's more effective when you're trying to house a lot of people to cluster homes together rather than kind of spread them all out willy-nilly. It makes it easier to produce goods because of agglomeration, right? You're going to want to be near like businesses to help cut down costs. It's easier to educate students because it's easier to divide up school zones, right? It'd be really difficult to divide up school zones if, there were houses scattered every which way. And it's much more easy for governments to function, right? Especially city and local or municipal governments. So we have ours are divided up into wards, right? So you should know, like, your city council person is not all the people on the city council. You have a specific person for your zone. Okay, so it just makes administration, government, things like that a lot easier when things are divided up into zones. Okay, so first model is called the bid rent model. So all of these pretty much have to do with structure of a city. This one has more to do with like land costs in a city, okay? So the price paid to rent or purchase urban land, so land that is in the city, is a reflection of how useful or wanted that piece of land is. And typically, land within the city is much more sought after and therefore more expensive than land outside of the city. Okay, so let me see. Let me get my little pointer dude here. Okay, so this is our model. Utility, this is how important it is. Okay, distance from the city center. Okay, so this tells you where things are likely to be located. So high volume retail is going to be probably pretty close to the city center. Okay. Factories a little bit further, but see they're lower in utility. Okay. So like accessibility to factories is not as important as accessibility to high volume retailing. Okay. Warehousing further from the city makes sense. They take up more space, right? And so hopefully what you're seeing here is like less people are going to want to access a warehouse than the high volume retailing, okay? Residential is furthest away from the city and it's got low utility because typically people do not want to work, or they do work in the city. They don't want to live in the city. They want to work in the suburbs because that's like better housing typically. Does that make sense? I'm going to go over this more in class. This is a little expensive. Little confusing. But what you need to know is that the closer things are to the city center, probably the higher the rent for those things. Okay? That's like the big takeaway. Okay. So we're going to divide these city models up into North American models and basically other models, okay? So the North American models are the concentric zone model. Burgess is the guy who came up with that. You should know that. The sector model, which is by Hoyt, and the multiple nuclei model, which is Harris and Ullman. This is what they each look like. Concentric zone, easy to remember, it's in circles. Sector, I don't know, is in sectors. Multiple nuclei model is kind of all over the place. So, let's see. When we talk about these land use models, for cities, there's things that we have to keep in mind, okay? So these are things that we assume about all of these models. That it's a heterogeneous society and culture, meaning there's rich people, and there's poor people. There's African Americans and there are white people. There are men, there are women, that sort of thing, okay? Competition for central land, CBD. Going back to this, the competition is higher, closer to the city center, the CBD, right? City center is typically where jobs are. That's where the employment is. Base of the economy is industry. Okay. Private land ownership, meaning that this is not government-owned land. It is owned by people who purchase it. Expansion from one zone to the next. Okay. Which means like zones are not put next to each other willy-nilly either. If this zone's residential, the next zone is going to have a connection to the people in those residences. That makes sense. No historical significance to influence land use. Now that is not typically true of most cities. All cities have like historical importance, but these models assume that they're not, okay? No differences in terrain, also something that's probably not true for a lot of cities, but we're assuming there's no like rivers in the middle of all of this and there's no mountains in the middle of all of this, okay? And hierarchy of land use, which is basically your bid rent model, okay? All right, so concentric zone model developed by Burgess in 1923. This is based on 1920s Chicago. It has 5 rings. The first ring is the CBD. The second one is the zone in transition, which is industry, lower income housing. So typically, like before the 1920s, high income housing would have been close to the CBD. But in North America, around the 1920s, that started to shift, and you didn't want to live next to the factories. You wanted to live further away. 3 is working class homes. 4 is zone of middle class homes. And 5 is the commuter zone. You could also call that the suburbs, okay? So this is low income, working class would be the next level, middle class is the next highest level, and we would call these probably like middle upper class homes in the commuter zone, okay? And then as areas expand, zones will overflow into subsequent zones. So it's not like these all stay clean. This kind of assumes that eventually zones bleed into other zones and everything starts to get like pushed further and further back. All right. This is what it looks like. We are going to draw this and take notes. But here's your CBD. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. All right. Sector model, Homer Hoyt, 1939. Hoyt thought there were limitations to Burgess's model. He took a little issue with the concentric zone model. He said that cities develop in sectors, not rings, and that industry develops along lines of transportation, okay? Whereas Burgess hadn't really thought of that, okay? And then newer housing develops on the outer edges of the sector, which would be in agreement with Burgess, by the way. So it kind of looks like this. It looks like slices of pie, sort of. So we have the CBD. It's in the same spot as it was with Burgess, right? Then our transportation and industry is this purple zone. Low class residential is this kind of pinky orange color. Okay. Middle class residential is this space right here, and high class residential is out here. So you can kind of see how a lot of this has to do with transportation, right? Transportation from the CBD. So it looks like that. Multiple nuclei model, also known as the galactic city model. Isn't that fun? Harrison Ullman in 1945. This shifted because the CBD started to lose its dominance. It wasn't as highly sought after as it was in the other two models. So there's multiple, almost like mini CBDs. So they're polycentric. And so there's activities that emerge around those multiple CBDs instead of just having, the one. This is because there's ports. Universities can often serve as little CBDs, airports, parks, suburban businesses. So there's these little clusters of things that draw people around them, right? And they might attract other activities, right? So universities are going to attract activities that are beneficial to education, right? Or things that college kids do for fun. So lots of bookstores, fast food, etc. Airports, you're going to have probably clusters of hotels around airports because a lot of times people are only staying for a little while when they land at an airport, right? So this is more like most North American cities you are going to see modern day. Chicago, even, I would say, is not really a concentric zone city anymore. It's more like a multiple nuclei model. I would definitely say that the Reno-Sparks area looks much more like a multiple nuclei model rather than a CBD, because Sparks has its own CBD, Reno has its own CBD. I mean, Spanish Springs, you could say, also kind of has its own little focus center, right? So multiple centers, multiple nuclei. Looks like this. Look how fun that is. So it gets a little more complicated as you see. It looks completely different. We still have a CBD, but now lots more emphasis on residential. Those are getting pushed further out. There's like a clear line between classes, right? They're not as mixed as they were in the concentric zone model. Okay, I'm going to start speeding it up a little bit here. Urban Realms model, James E. Vance, 1964, was an attempt to improve the multiple nuclei model. It's based on San Francisco. The city is made up of small realms, which are self-sufficient, meaning they don't rely on other realms. They have all that they need within them, okay? So the things that influence realms are terrain, size of the metropolis, strength of economic activity within a realm, internal accessibility, interaccessibility. Like how easy is it to get around in the realm? How easy is it to get to other realms? Okay. So most geographers think this is more accurate than a lot of those traditional models that we just went over. They're really wacky looking. It looks like this. So you're probably not going to be asked to like memorize the Urban Realms model, but you should know that it exists and it's supposed to be an improvement on the other models. Okay, models outside of North America. Here we go. Latin America model, 1980, combines traditional Latin American culture with forces of globalization. There is a CBD. Within the CBD, traditional markets, high-rise buildings, a commercial spine. So this all extends out from the CBD. I'm just going to show it to you actually. So this is what it looks like. This is the Latin American city model. So here's your CBD. Now, here, this has some things that are different than the North American city model. So you have your market areas, your zones of maturity are going to be zones that are probably experiencing, well, here, there's a gentrification zone. These are zones that are maturing, probably increasing in land value, I would say. But there's this also. All of this orange and this right here are disamenity zones, or sometimes what we call squatter settlements, okay? Meaning that squatters live in these areas. They did not purchase homes. They make homes out of whatever they can find. Why does this happen? Well, a lot of it has to do with the yellow and green right here. So these areas become too expensive for people to afford, so they get pushed out. Okay? So much so that the housing prices might be so high that they can't afford to purchase anything, and that's kind of how you get squatter settlements. Okay? So that's what makes the Latin American city model quite different. European models, streets are a lot more narrow because they're old cities. They were developed before cars. Arranged like root systems of trees. Lots of North American cities are grid systems, right? That's why you have like a first street, second street, third street, fourth street, right? Not so in Europe. It's all over the place. Skyscrapers are located further away from the city center. And then something that is common in European cities are green belts, which is where you basically make a zone of greenery around your city that is, you use that for like agriculture or parks or something like that. And the idea is you're not supposed to build beyond the green belt. So it keeps your city contained. It helps prevent urban sprawl when like the urban areas start to get further and further and further out. Okay. Southeast Asia model, 1967. This one's a lot more focused on economics of a city than other city models are. There is no CBD. There is a port that is the focus of this model. Okay, what makes this one different? So we have squatter areas. These yellow things are a different thing, though. These are alien commercial zones. And this is where you would have foreign workers. So like workers who came from, I think most of this is for China, and they would come in and work and not necessarily be citizens of that country. Okay? But it has different zones, as you can see. The kind of like a green belt sort of thing going on right here, a market gardening zone, right? Okay. Sub-Saharan Africa model. These are really interesting because it takes into account that there is parts of the city that were developed by colonial powers, and then there's also parts of the city that were developed either post-colonial or pre-colonial. So they typically have 3 CBDs. The colonial CBD, the one that the colonists decided, like, this is the CBD, the market zone, where their marketplaces are, and the traditional CBD, okay? So it looks like this. So colonial, traditional, market zone, neighborhoods, more neighborhoods plus mining and manufacturing, and informal satellite townships, could mean that they're probably controlled by this city, but there's probably not a lot of connection between the people in those outskirts and the city itself. All right, so here they are. African city model, Latin American city model, Southeast Asian city model. Those are the ones you need to know that are outside of North America. Plus, sorry, the Islamic city model, which looks sort of like this. You never really get asked to like memorize the Islamic city model because sometimes I see it and it looks totally different. But basically what you need to know is religion plays a major part in an Islamic city. There are cul-de-sacs and lots of dead-end streets because they don't want a lot of foot traffic. Open air markets, light colored surfaces. Buildings are designed to catch rainwater. And the reason they have lots of twisting streets is because that maximizes shade. So just know those kind of basic principles of Islamic city models. There it is. Oh, all right, we did it. I went through those really, really fast, but we are going to go through all of them individually, and it'll be okay, I promise. So I will meet you back here for Chapter 3, Key Issue 3, which is coming up next. And I hope that wasn't too long.